The space around the Centauri Nebula filled with ships. Not just a few ships, but hundreds of them. They moved like a great dark cloud across the stars, each one bigger than a city block back on Earth. The Krelian Empire had sent their war fleet, and it was a sight that would make any sane person run away as fast as possible. Admiral Zexthul stood in the command center of his flagship, the Devourer of Stars. His ship was the biggest of them all, stretching over 2 miles from front to back. The walls around him were not made of metal like human ships. Instead, they were alive, pulsing with a green light that showed the ship's heartbeat. The Krelians built their ships from living creatures, growing them in vast pools until they became weapons of war. Through the clear wall that served as a window, Zexthul could see his entire fleet. 312 ships, each one ready to destroy and consume everything in their path. The Admiral's forearms moved across the control panels, checking reports from his captains. Each report said the same thing. They were ready for battle. The Krelians had swept through this part of space like fire through dry grass. 17 star systems had fallen to them in the past year. Each time it was the same story. They would arrive, demand surrender, and when the local defense forces tried to fight, they would crush them completely. Then came the consumption phase, where their bioships would literally eat the defeated vessels and use the materials to grow stronger. Zexthul had been doing this for over 200 years. He was old even by Krelian standards, and he had seen every kind of enemy the galaxy could throw at him. Proud warrior races who fought until the last ship was destroyed. Clever merchant species who tried to buy their way out of destruction. Peaceful farmers who begged for mercy. None of it mattered. The Krelian Empire consumed them all. Today's target was different, though. The humans had only been in space for a few decades, but they had spread out quickly, building colonies on dozens of worlds. Intelligence reports said they were primitive, using crude metal ships and simple weapons. Their military was small and scattered, trying to protect too many places with too few ships. The Admiral's tactical officer, a younger Krelian named Klex Minor, approached with the latest scout reports. His 6 legs clicked on the living floor as he moved, and his compound eyes glowed with excitement. "Great Admiral," Klex Minor said, his voice making the buzzing sound that all Krelians used when they were happy. "The human patrol fleet has been located. Only 12 ships stand between us and the Outer Rim colonies." Zexthul took the data pad and studied the information. 12 ships, against his 300. It was almost insulting. Most species at least tried to gather a decent force before facing the Krelian fleet. But these humans seemed to think that 12 small vessels could somehow stop the greatest war machine in the galaxy. "What types of ships, Guy?" the Admiral asked. "Mix of their standard classes, sir. 1 heavy cruiser, 5 destroyers, and 6 frigates. Total crew estimated at less than 8,000 beings. Our smallest biocruiser carries more warriors than their entire fleet." Zexthul handed back the datapad. In all his years of warfare, he had never seen such a mismatch. Part of him almost felt sorry for the humans. Almost. But the Krelian Empire had not conquered half the galaxy by showing mercy to brave fools. Far across the void, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty. His ship was the pride of the Earth Space Force, a heavy cruiser built in the orbital shipyards above Mars. She was 400 meters long and packed with the best weapons and defenses that human technology could provide. But looking at the tactical display showing the approaching Krelian fleet, Morrison knew that his best might not be enough. The bridge around him was quiet, except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. His crew worked at their stations with the calm efficiency that came from years of training. These were not new recruits or weekend warriors. Every person on this bridge had volunteered to stand between the Krelians and the human colonies, knowing full well what that choice meant. Commander Lisa Brooks, his second in command, stood beside his captain's chair reviewing the latest intelligence reports. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but Morrison had seen her stare down admirals twice her size when she thought they were making a mistake. Right now, her face showed the same expression she got when working through a difficult problem. "Final. Count as 312 enemy vessels," she said, her voice steady. "Long-range sensors show bioship construction. which matches what we know about Krillian technology. They'll have regenerative hulls, organic weapon systems, and crews that can survive in hard vacuum. Morrison nodded. He had read all the reports, from the colonies that had faced the Krillians. The few survivors always told the same story: ships that could heal themselves, weapons that seemed to think for themselves, and enemies that never seemed to get tired or scared. "What about our fleet?" he asked. "All 11 ships report ready for action. Captains Davis, Rodriguez, and the others are standing by for orders. Ammunition is full, reactors are running hot, and morale is good." Morrison walked to the main display screen that showed their small formation. 12 ships against over 300. Any reasonable person would call it suicide. But as Morrison looked at each ship on the screen, he thought about the people inside them. People who had left Earth to build new homes among the stars. People who had families waiting for them in the colonies. People who deserved to live free from the fear of being consumed by alien predators. The communication system beeped, and Morrison pressed the button to open a channel to the entire fleet. 11 other captains appeared on his screen, each one showing the same mix of determination and fear that he felt in his own chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, "long-range sensors show the Krillian fleet will reach our position in 6 hours. They outnumber us badly, and they have advantages in technology and experience that we can't match through normal tactics." He paused, looking at each face on the screen. These were good people, brave people, who had chosen to serve in Earth's growing space navy. Some of them had been with him since the early days when humanity was just learning to build ships that could travel between stars. "But we have something they don't understand," Morrison continued. "We're not fighting for conquest or resources or territory. We're fighting for our homes. We're fighting for the right of human beings to live free among the stars. And we're fighting because no one else can." Captain Paul Davis of the destroyer Phoenix spoke up. "What are your orders, sir?" Morrison looked out at the stars, thinking about the colonies behind them, families sleeping peacefully, not knowing that their entire way of life hung in the balance. Children playing in the domed cities of New California and Harmony Station. Farmers working the soil of worlds that had never known life before humans brought it there. "We hold the line," Morrison said. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we hold the line. Signal all ships to prepare for battle and make sure our colors are flying high. When the Krillians get here, I want them to see exactly who they're dealing with." The screen went dark as the other captains returned to their ships to prepare. Morrison stood alone on his bridge, looking out at the approaching enemy fleet. In a few hours, the battle would begin. 12 human ships against 300 alien ones. It should have been hopeless, but Jake Morrison had not spent his entire adult life in the service of Earth just to give up when things got difficult. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered the old saying from the ancient wars on Earth: "It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog." The Krillians were about to learn what that meant. The bridge of the Devourer of Stars filled with the sound of Krillian laughter. It was not a pleasant sound to human ears, more like the clicking of 1,000 insects mixed with the hiss of steam escaping from a broken pipe. But to the Krillians, it was the sound of joy and amusement. Sub-Admiral Klexminer stood before the main tactical display, his 6 arms pointing at the small group of human ships that dared to block their path. His compound eyes sparkled with what could only be called delight as he studied the enemy formation. 12 ships, he said, his voice carrying across the bridge so that every Krillian present could hear. 12 tiny metal boxes against the might of the greatest fleet in Krillian history. Do they think this is some kind of joke? The other officers joined in the laughter. Commander Vex Tala, who controlled the bioweapon systems, made the buzzing sound that meant she found something. Very funny. Perhaps they are offering themselves as food. It would save us the trouble of hunting them down. Admiral Zexthal watched this display with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of many civilizations. Unlike his younger officers, he did not join in the laughter. Something about the human formation troubled him, though he could not put his finger on exactly what it was. The human ships were arranged in a pattern that seemed almost defensive, but not quite. They were not running away, which most species did when faced with such overwhelming odds. They were not charging forward in a desperate attack, which some of the braver races attempted. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something. Scan. Their vessels again, Zexthul ordered. I want to know everything about their weapons, their defenses, and their crew numbers. The scanning officer, a thin Krillian whose name was too complex for most other species to pronounce, worked his controls, with quick, nervous movements. After several minutes, he looked up with confusion written across his features. Great Admiral, the scans are strange. Their ships appear to be standard human construction, but there are energy readings that do not match our intelligence reports. Also, their formation suggests they are powered up for battle, but we cannot determine their full weapons capability. Zexthul moved to the scanning station and looked at the data himself. The human ships did indeed show unusual energy patterns. Their reactors were running much hotter than intelligence reports suggested, was normal for human vessels. More importantly, there were power signatures coming from sections of their ships that the Krillians had assumed were just empty space. What is their largest ship? The Admiral asked. The heavy cruiser in the center of their formation. 400 meters long, estimated crew of 800 beings. Our intelligence files identify it as the UES Liberty, commanded by a human named Jake Morrison. Zexthul had heard that name before. He accessed the deep memory banks of his flagship's biocomputer, searching through records of human military officers. What he found made his exoskeleton crawl with the first hint of unease. Jake Morrison had served in the human colonial wars, the bitter conflicts that had torn through human space before the formation of the United Earth government. He had commanded ships in 17 major battles and had never lost a single engagement. More troubling, he had a reputation for winning fights that should have been impossible to win. Pull up the tactical files on human colonial warfare, Zexthul ordered. The data that appeared on his screen made him pause. Humans, it seemed, had spent most of their short time in space fighting each other. The colonial wars had been brutal affairs where small fleets regularly defeated much larger ones through superior tactics and sheer determination. The files showed battle after battle where human commanders had found ways to win against impossible odds. But there was something else in the files that made Zexthul's blood run cold. Humans, unlike most species, seemed to get more dangerous when they were cornered. Other races would surrender when faced with certain death. Humans would fight harder. Sub-Admiral Klexminer noticed his commander's silence and approached the Admiral's position. Great Admiral, shall we begin the attack? Our bioships are eager to feed. Zexthul looked at the tactical display again. 12 ships against 312. By every measure of military logic, this should be a massacre that would last perhaps 10 minutes. But something deep in his warrior's instincts told him that this battle would not be as simple as his officers believed. Signal the human fleet, he ordered. I wish to speak with their commander. The bridge fell silent. In all their years of service, none of the Krillian officers had ever seen their admiral attempt to communicate with prey before consuming it. Usually the Krillians simply arrived, destroyed all resistance, and began the feeding process. The communications officer, a young Krillian who had only recently been promoted to bridge duty, worked his controls with shaking hands. After several minutes, he managed to establish a connection with the human flagship. The main display screen flickered and then showed the bridge of the human vessel. It was a stark contrast to the organic curves and living walls of the Krillian ship. Everything was clean metal and sharp angles, with soft lights that did not pulse or change color. And standing in the center of it all was the human commander. Captain Jake Morrison looked exactly like what Zexthul had expected from reading his service record. He was tall for a human, with graying hair that spoke of many years in space. His uniform was neat and clean, but his eyes held the hard look of someone who had seen too much combat. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady. I am Captain Morrison of the United Earth Space Force. You have entered human space without permission and threatened our colonies. I assume you wish to discuss terms for your withdrawal. The Krillian bridge erupted in the clicking laughter. Again. Sub-Admiral Klexminer could barely contain his amusement. He thinks we wish to negotiate. A single human, commanding 12 ships, believes he is in a position to make demands of the Krillian Empire. But Admiral Zexthul was not laughing. He studied the human commander's face, looking for signs of fear or desperation. What he saw instead was something that chilled him to the bone. Morrison showed no fear at all. Instead, there was a quiet confidence in his expression, as if he knew something that the Krillians did not. "Human," Zexthul said, his voice carrying across the communication link. "I am Admiral Zexthul of the Krillian Empire. You face the largest war fleet ever assembled by my people. Your 12 ships cannot possibly stand against us. Surrender now, and we will make your deaths quick." Morrison's expression did not change. He looked directly into the camera, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made every Krillian on the bridge stop their laughter. "Admiral, you clearly do not understand who you are dealing with. These are not just 12 ships. These are 12 ships of the United Earth Space Force, crewed by men and women who took an oath to defend human space against all enemies. We do not surrender, we do not retreat, and we do not lose." The communication link went dead, leaving the Krillian bridge in uncomfortable silence. Sub-Admiral Klexminer tried to restart his laughter, but it sounded forced and hollow. Admiral Zexthul stared at the now empty screen, his mind racing through possibilities. In his long career, he had learned to recognize certain patterns among the species he had conquered. There were those who fought bravely but accepted defeat when it became clear they could not win. There were those who fled when faced with superior force. And then there were the rare few who would literally die before giving up. Something in Jake Morrison's voice told him that humans belonged to that third category, and that made them far more dangerous than their small fleet suggested. "Prepare for battle," Zexthul ordered, his voice lacking the confidence it had held just minutes before. "And signal all ships to expect heavy resistance. These humans may be small in number, but I suspect they will not die easily." As the Krillian fleet began its final approach, Admiral Zexthul found himself wondering if 12 ships might somehow be enough after all. The distance between the two fleets closed like the gap in a closing trap. What had been millions of kilometers of empty space an hour ago was now less than 50,000. At this range, the weapons of both sides could reach their targets with deadly accuracy. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty, watching the tactical display as the massive Krillian fleet approached. Each enemy ship showed up as a red dot on his screen, and there were so many dots that they almost formed a solid wall of color. But Morrison was not looking at the number of enemy ships. He was watching their formation and their approach pattern. "Lisa," he said to Commander Brooks, "signal all ships. Execute battle formation Alpha 7. Brooks pressed the communication controls and sent the coded message to the rest of the human fleet. On the tactical display, Morrison watched as his 12 ships moved into a new pattern. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like they were just spreading out randomly. But Morrison knew better. Each ship moved to a specific position that had been planned weeks ago when Earth Command first learned about the Krillian threat. The formation looked simple, but it was designed to allow each human vessel to support the others while maximizing their firepower against a much larger enemy force. Something else was happening to the human ships, something that the Krillians had not expected. As each vessel reached its position, its hull began to change. What had looked like simple metal plating started to shift and reconfigure. Weapon ports that had been closed opened up to reveal guns that were much larger than the Krillian intelligence reports had suggested. Armor sections slid apart to show additional defensive systems that should not have been able to fit inside such small ships. But the most important change was not in the ships themselves. It was in the symbols they displayed. Each human vessel carried the same emblem on its hull, a simple circle showing a blue and green world against the black of space. Earth, the homeworld of humanity. As the ships powered up their weapons and defensive systems, this emblem began to glow with a soft blue light that could be seen across the darkness between the fleets. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, the Krillian officers watched this transformation with growing alarm. The scanning officer worked frantically at his controls, trying to understand what was happening to the human ships. "Great, Admiral," he reported, his voice shaking with confusion. "The human vessels are showing Power readings that exceed our previous estimates by over 300%. Their weapon systems are not what our intelligence reports described. Admiral Zexthal moved to the scanning station and looked at the data himself. The numbers on the screen made no sense. According to Krillian intelligence, human ships were primitive affairs with simple weapons and basic defenses. But the vessels he was seeing now showed energy signatures that rivaled some of the Empire's own biocruisers. How is this possible? Sub-Admiral Klexminer demanded. Our spies have been watching human ship construction for years. These are the same vessels we identified in our reports. The Admiral studied the tactical display more carefully. The human ships had not grown larger or added new sections, but somehow they were now showing capabilities that had been completely hidden before. It was as if the vessels had been designed to look weak while concealing their true strength. Deception, Zexthal said quietly. They wanted us to underestimate them. On the human flagship, Morrison opened a communication channel to his entire fleet. The faces of 11 other captains appeared on his screen, each one showing the same mixture of determination and fear that he felt in his own chest. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison began, the enemy is now within weapons range. You all know what we're fighting for today. Behind us are 17 human colonies with over 40 million people. Men, women, and children who are depending on us to keep them safe. Captain Paul Davis of the destroyer Phoenix spoke up. Sir, we're ready. All systems are green and crews are at battle stations. Captain Michelle Rodriguez of the frigate Ranger nodded in agreement. My ship is ready as well, Captain. We won't let you down. Morrison looked at each face on the screen. These were good people, brave people who had volunteered to serve in Earth's Space Navy knowing that someday they might face a situation exactly like this one. They had families of their own waiting for them back home, but they were willing to risk everything to protect people they had never met. Remember, Morrison continued, we're not just fighting as individual ships today. We're fighting as one unit, one force, one family. Trust your training, trust your equipment, and trust each other. And remember that every person in this fleet carries the spirit of every human who ever looked up at the stars and dreamed of flying among them. The communication link closed, leaving Morrison alone with his thoughts. Through the bridge windows, he could see the approaching Krillian fleet. Even at this distance, the alien ships looked like living nightmares, their bioholes pulsing with an unhealthy green light. But Morrison was not afraid. He had been in worse situations before, during the colonial wars when human fought human, across a dozen star systems. He had learned that the size of your fleet mattered less than the courage of your crews and the righteousness of your cause. The Krillians had come to human space believing they faced a weak and scattered enemy. They had expected to find ships crewed by soft colonists who would surrender at the first sign of real danger. Instead, they had found something that their intelligence reports had never prepared them for. They had found Earth's children, ready to fight. The tactical officer on Morrison's bridge announced that the enemy fleet was now within optimal weapons range. The moment of truth had arrived. Across the void, 300 Krillian bioships prepared to attack what they still believed were 12 primitive human vessels. But as the range closed to the final few thousand kilometers, something happened that shook the Krillian fleet to its core. The human ships stopped hiding what they really were. The Liberty's main guns, which had appeared to be standard laser cannons, revealed themselves to be something far more advanced. Energy readings spiked as the weapons charged to levels that should have been impossible for a ship of that size. The destroyer Phoenix showed similar transformations, its hull sliding apart to reveal missile tubes that had been completely hidden from Krillian scans. All across the human formation, ships that had looked like simple patrol vessels revealed themselves to be warships that had been designed from the ground up to fight enemies exactly like the Krillians. Every line of their hulls, every weapon system, every defensive measure had been planned and built by people who knew that humanity's survival might depend on ships like these being able to fight against impossible odds. And blazing from the hull of every human ship was the emblem of Earth, glowing like a blue star against the darkness. It was more than just a symbol. It was a declaration that the children of that small blue world would not go quietly into the night. Admiral Zexthul stared at his tactical display as the true nature of the human fleet revealed itself. For the first time in over 200 years of warfare, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Doubt. Signal all ships, he ordered, his voice lacking the confidence it had held just hours before. Prepare for heavy resistance, and may the great darkness preserve us all. The battle was about to begin, and both sides knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The first shot of the battle came not from the massive Krillian fleet, but from a single human destroyer. Captain Paul Davis of the Phoenix had been watching the enemy formation through his tactical display when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The Krillian bioships were beginning to extend feeding tentacles from their hulls, preparing to consume the human vessels after the battle was over. Like hell, Davis muttered, and pressed the firing controls. The Phoenix's main gun sent a beam of pure energy across the void, striking the lead Krillian cruiser directly in what appeared to be its head section. The alien ship convulsed as the energy tore through its living hull, green fluid spraying into space from the wound. But instead of dying, the bioship began to regenerate, its damaged sections growing back like healing flesh. That single shot changed everything. Suddenly, space filled with deadly light as both fleets opened fire at the same time. The Krillian bioships launched streams of acidic projectiles that could eat through any known armor. They fired energy weapons that seemed to think for themselves, curving around obstacles to strike their targets. Some of the larger ships released clouds of smaller organisms that swarmed toward the human vessels like living missiles. But the humans were ready for them. The Liberty's defensive systems came online with a roar of power that could be felt through the ship's hull. Point defense guns tracked and destroyed the incoming swarm creatures with rapid bursts of plasma fire. When the Krillian acid projectiles struck the human ship's armor, they found not simple metal but adaptive plating that changed its molecular structure to resist the attack. Captain Morrison stood in the center of his bridge, calling out orders to his crew with the calm voice of someone who had done this many times before. Helm, bring us around to bearing 270. Weapons, target their command ship and fire when ready. Engineering, I need more power to forward shields. The Liberty turned through space like a dancer, her movements smooth and precise despite the storm of enemy fire around her. When her main gun spoke, they sent beams of energy that struck the Krillian flagship with enough force to crack a moon. But the Devourer of Stars was built to withstand such attacks, and its bioarmor absorbed most of the damage. Across the battlefield, the other human ships were fighting their own desperate battles. The destroyer Phoenix had attracted the attention of 5 Krillian cruisers, and Captain Davis was using every trick he had learned in 20 years of military service to keep his ship alive. He dove toward a group of asteroids at the edge of the nebula, using the space rocks as cover, while his weapons carved through the alien ships that followed him. Rodriguez, take your squadron through their left flank. Morrison's voice came over the communication system. Davis, I need you to draw their heavy cruisers into the nebula where their numbers won't help them. Captain Michelle Rodriguez of the Frigate Ranger acknowledged the order and led 3 other ships on a high-speed run along the edge of the Krillian formation. Her vessels were smaller and faster than the enemy bioships, and she used that advantage to strike at their flanks before they could bring their main weapons to bear. But it was what happened next that truly shocked the Krillian fleet. The human ships began to fight not as individual vessels but as parts of a single organism. When the destroyer Charleston came under heavy attack from a group of Krillian fighters, the cruiser Denver was instantly there to provide covering fire. When the frigate Austin's shields failed, the destroyer Portland moved to block incoming fire with its own armored hull. It was coordination beyond anything the Krillians had ever seen. Their own bioships were connected through organic neural networks, but they still fought as separate entities. The humans seemed to know what each other were thinking, reacting to threats and opportunities with a speed that defied explanation. Admiral Zexthul watched this display from his flagship with growing horror. His tactical officer was reporting damage to over 30 Krillian vessels, while the humans had lost only 1 ship. The destroyer Birmingham had been overwhelmed by a swarm of biofighters, but even as it died, its captain had rammed his vessel into the largest enemy cruiser, destroying both ships in a massive explosion. How are they doing this? Sub-Admiral Klex Minor demanded, his voice high with panic. Our ships outnumber theirs 20-1, but they're winning. Zexthul studied the tactical display, trying to understand what he was seeing. The human fleet moved with a precision that spoke of neural linking technology. But their ships were not bioorganic like Krillian vessels. Somehow, they had achieved the same level of coordination using their primitive electronic systems. Then, he saw something that made his exoskeleton crawl with fear. The human heavy cruiser Liberty was not just fighting defensively. It was hunting. Morrison had brought his ship deep into the Krillian formation, using its superior firepower to target the bioship's command vessels. Every shot was precisely aimed at the spots where the enemy ship's nervous systems were most vulnerable. He knows, Zexthul whispered. Somehow he knows how our ships are built. The Admiral was right. Human intelligence had been studying captured Krillian technology for months, learning the weak points of their bioships and developing weapons specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. When the Liberty's guns fired, they sent energy, pulses tuned to disrupt the neural networks that controlled the alien vessels. Captain Morrison's voice cut across the battle communications. All ships execute Protocol 7 on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for generations to come. Every human ship suddenly changed course at exactly the same moment, creating gaps in their formation that the Krillian bioships rushed to fill. But it was a trap. As the alien vessels moved into those gaps, they found themselves caught in crossfire from multiple human ships, their formation broken and their coordination destroyed. The frigate Ranger under Captain Rodriguez managed to slip through the confusion and strike at the Krillian flagship itself. Her small ship's weapons should not have been able to penetrate the massive bioship's defenses, but Rodriguez had noticed something that the enemy's own officers had missed. The Devourer of Stars had been damaged in an earlier engagement, and one section of its hull showed signs of incomplete regeneration. Rodriguez aimed her ship's main gun at that weak spot and fired everything she had. The energy beam burned through the living hull like fire through paper, causing the massive ship to convulse in what could only be called agony. For the first time in the battle, Admiral Zexthul felt his flagship shake under his feet. But the humans were paying a price for their aggressive tactics. The destroyer Phoenix, after fighting brilliantly against impossible odds, finally succumbed to damage from multiple bioships. Captain Davis's last transmission was simple and clear. For Earth and her children. His ship exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the entire battlefield, taking 2 Krillian cruisers with it into destruction. The loss of the Phoenix sent a wave of anger through the human fleet that the Krillians could actually feel. The remaining ships fought with increased fury, their weapons finding targets with deadly accuracy. It was as if the death of their comrade had awakened something primal in the human crews, something that turned them from disciplined soldiers into avenging angels. Admiral Zexthul stared at his tactical display and realized that the impossible was happening. His fleet of over 300 ships was being defeated by 11 human vessels. The bioships that had conquered 17 star systems were being destroyed by enemies they had dismissed as primitive. For the first time in over 200 years of warfare, Admiral Zexthul began to consider the possibility of retreat. The turning point came when Captain Michelle Rodriguez realized that her frigate Ranger was going to die. Her ship had taken heavy damage from 3 Krillian biocruisers, and her hull was cracking under the strain of continuous enemy fire. Half her crew was dead or wounded, and her main engines were failing. But Rodriguez was not ready to give up. She had noticed something during the battle that gave her an idea. The Krillian flagship, the massive Devourer of Stars, had a section of damaged hull that was still trying to regenerate from an earlier hit. The bio-armor there was thin and weak, like skin over a healing wound. All power to forward weapons, Rodriguez ordered her surviving crew. Everything we have left. Her weapons officer, a young man named Tony Martinez who had joined the space, forced straight out of college, looked at her with understanding in his eyes. Ma'am, if we fire everything at once, it will overload our systems. The ship won't survive it. I know, Rodriguez said quietly. But maybe we can take that big bastard with us. The Ranger turned toward the enemy flagship, its damaged hull groaning under the stress of the maneuver. Rodriguez pushed her engines beyond their safety limits, racing through the space between the two fleets while enemy fire lit up the darkness around her. On the bridge of the Devourer of Stars, Admiral Zexthul watched the small human ship approaching, with growing alarm. His tactical officer was shouting warnings about the frigate's power readings, but there was no time to respond. Rodriguez fired every weapon her ship had, all at the same moment. The energy beam that erupted from the Ranger was so bright it could be seen across the entire battlefield. It struck the damaged section of the Krillian flagship with the force of a falling star, burning through the bio-armor and deep into the ship's living structure. The Devourer of Stars screamed. It was not a sound that any normal ship could make, but the bioship was a living creature as much as it was a vessel of war. The beam had struck something vital, some organ or nerve center that controlled the massive ship's functions. Green fluid sprayed from the wound like blood from a cut artery. The Ranger exploded a moment later, its overloaded systems finally giving out. But Captain Rodriguez had achieved something that no one thought possible. She had wounded the greatest warship in the Krillian fleet, maybe mortally. Admiral Zexthul felt his flagship shudder around him as damage control systems tried to heal the wound. But this was different from the normal damage of battle. The human weapon had been designed specifically to disrupt bioship regeneration, and the healing process was failing. For the first time in his long career, Zexthul felt the cold touch of fear. He looked at his tactical display and saw something that made his blood run cold. His fleet had started the battle with over 300 ships. Now fewer than 200 were still able to fight. The humans had begun with 12 vessels and still had 8 in action. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At this rate of loss, the Krillian fleet would be completely destroyed within the hour. But it was more than just the numbers that frightened the admiral. It was the way the humans fought. When the Phoenix had been destroyed, the other human ships had not retreated or become demoralized. Instead, they had fought harder, as if the death of their companion had filled them with uncontrollable rage. When the Ranger had sacrificed itself to wound his flagship, the remaining human vessels had pressed their attack with renewed fury. They were not fighting like rational beings trying to achieve a military objective. They were fighting like protective parents defending their children from monsters. Zexthul accessed his ship's deep memory banks, searching for any reference to this kind of behavior. What he found there made him understand, finally, what kind of enemy he was facing. Humans were pack hunters. On their homeworld, they had evolved as social creatures who worked together to bring down prey much larger and stronger than themselves. But more than that, they were also protective of their family groups. When threatened, they would fight with a ferocity that bordered on madness. The admiral found files from Krillian scouts who had observed human colonies defending against raiders. The reports all said the same thing. Humans became more dangerous when their homes were threatened, not less. They would sacrifice themselves without hesitation to protect others of their kind. And that was exactly what was happening here. Captain Morrison's voice came over the communication channels, speaking to his remaining ships. All vessels, the enemy flagship is wounded. Press the attack. Make them pay for every human life they've taken. The Liberty led the charge, its weapons blazing as it drove deep into the heart of the Krillian formation. The other human ships followed, their coordination still perfect despite the losses they had suffered. They fought not like individual captains commanding separate vessels, but like fingers of the same hand, each one working toward the same goal. Admiral Zexthul watched this display and made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours before. He opened a communication channel to his entire fleet. All ships, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. Withdraw to the outer system boundary. Retreat. The bridge of the Devourer of Stars fell silent. Sub-Admiral Klexmanor stared at his commander with compound eyes wide with shock. Great Admiral, we still outnumber them. We can still win this battle. Zexthul looked at his tactical display one more time. The human ships were regrouping for another attack, their emblems still glowing with that soft blue light that seemed to mock the Krillian fleet. Look at the numbers, Sub-Admiral. We began with 300 ships and now have fewer than 200 combat-ready vessels. They started with 12 and still field 8. If this battle continues, they will destroy us completely. But there was more to his decision than simple mathematics. In his long career of conquest, Admiral Zexthul had learned to recognize certain types of enemies. There were those who fought bravely, but accepted defeat when it became hopeless. There were those who fled when faced with superior force. And then there were the rare species who would literally fight to the death rather than surrender. Humans, he now understood, belonged to that final category. They would never give up, never retreat, never accept defeat as long as a single ship remained operational. They would fight until every last one of them was dead, and they would take as many Krillians with them as possible. As the Krillian fleet began its withdrawal, Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty, watching the enemy formation break apart and retreat toward the jump point. Commander Brooks approached with casualty reports, her face showing the exhaustion that came after desperate battle. 4 ships lost, sir. Heavy damage to 3 others, but we held the line. Morrison nodded, his eyes still fixed on the retreating enemy fleet. After a moment, he turned to his communications officer. Signal the Krillian flagship. I want to speak with their admiral one more time. When Admiral Zexthul appeared on the screen, he looked like a being who had aged years in the space of a few hours. His compound eyes were dim, and his posture spoke of defeat and weariness. Admiral, Morrison said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. You came to our space believing we were weak because our fleet was small. Today you learned that humans do not measure strength in numbers. We measure it in determination. Take this lesson back to your empire. Earth's children do not start fights, but we always finish them. The communication ended, leaving Admiral Zexthul alone with his thoughts as his flagship limped toward the jump point. Behind them, the human fleet began the process of rescue and recovery, their emblems still shining like blue stars against the darkness. The Battle of Centauri Nebula was over. 12 human ships had faced over 300 Krillian vessels and emerged victorious. Word of this impossible victory would spread across the galaxy, carried by traders and diplomats to every inhabited world. Never again would anyone underestimate the small fleets that bore the emblem of Earth.